February 19th, 1945. The morning air over Iwo Jima reeked of sulfur and cordite as 6 young Navajo Marines crouched behind radio equipment on the black volcanic beach. Over the next 36 days, they would transmit more than 800 messages while Japanese cryptographers intercepted every single word. The enemy recorded the transmissions, analyzed the patterns, tortured prisoners for information, and deployed their most brilliant minds to crack what they were hearing. They failed completely. Not one message was ever deciphered. This is the story of how a language forbidden in American schools became the only unbreakable code in modern military history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. May 1942. Camp Elliott, California. Lieutenant Colonel James Jones stood before a classified demonstration that would either revolutionize Marine Corps communications or waste precious wartime resources on an experiment that defied conventional military wisdom. The crisis facing American forces in the Pacific was immediate and deadly. Japanese intelligence officers had systematically broken every code the United States military used to protect battlefield communications. Their cryptographers, trained in the German tradition and equipped with captured codebooks, intercepted radio transmissions, and deciphered American intentions with terrifying efficiency. They knew where Marines would land before the landing craft hit the water. They knew which supply routes convoys would take, which airfields bombers would strike, which defensive positions infantry would assault. The consequences played out in blood across the Pacific. American forces walked into ambushes that shouldn't have been possible. Japanese defenders concentrated their forces at precisely the points where Marine assaults would come. Artillery barrages landed on assembly areas that should have been secret. The enemy wasn't just good at code breaking. They had turned American communications into a weapon against American forces. Traditional encryption methods couldn't solve the problem. The Sigaba machine, the most sophisticated cipher device the United States possessed, required 30 minutes to encode a 3-line message. On a battlefield where artillery coordinates needed to be transmitted in seconds, where tactical situations changed faster than machines could process information, mechanical encryption was worse than useless. It was an invitation to disaster. Marines needed to communicate at the speed of combat. They needed to coordinate artillery strikes while under fire. They needed to relay troop movements as they happened. They needed to call in air support without delay that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. And they needed to do all of this while Japanese intelligence officers listened to every word. The solution standing before Colonel Jones that morning seemed impossible. 4 young Navajo men prepared to demonstrate that their native language, a tongue spoken by fewer than 30,000 people in the remote Southwest, could become a military asset more valuable than any mechanical cipher ever devised. The man who brought these 4 Navajo speakers to Camp Elliott understood something about language that most military officers had never considered. Philip Johnston was 51 years old that spring of 1942, a civil engineer with a graduate degree from the University of Southern California. But his most valuable credential had been earned decades earlier in the most unlikely place imaginable. Johnston had grown up on the Navajo Reservation, the son of missionaries who arrived in Arizona when Philip was only 4 years old. While other white children learned English in schoolhouses, Philip Johnston learned Navajo while playing with Navajo children on the vast plateau of the reservation. He absorbed the language at the age when human brains imprint linguistic patterns most deeply, when sounds and meanings fuse in ways that can never be replicated through adult study. In 1901, when Philip was 9 years old, his father traveled to Washington, D.C., with Navajo leaders to meet the newly inaugurated President Theodore Roosevelt. The Navajo leaders wanted to petition for additional land to be added to their reservation. They needed someone who could translate their concerns with precision and nuance. Philip Johnston, at 9 years old, served as the interpreter between Navajo leaders and the President of the United States. Roosevelt added the requested land to the Navajo Nation. Johnston left the reservation to attend Northern Arizona Normal School, then enlisted in the Army during World War I. In France, serving with the 319th Engineers, he heard stories about Choctaw soldiers who had transmitted messages in their native language during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The Germans, who had broken nearly every Allied code on the Western Front, found themselves unable to decipher these transmissions. The Choctaw experiment had been improvised, informal, limited in scope, but it had worked. 24 years later, after Pearl Harbor brought America into another world war, Johnston read a newspaper article about Native American soldiers transmitting practice messages in their tribal languages during Army training exercises. The article triggered a connection in his mind between the old Choctaw experiment and the new Japanese code-breaking threat. Johnston knew something that few people outside the Navajo Nation understood. The Navajo language wasn't just obscure, it was fundamentally different from the linguistic families that Japanese cryptographers would have encountered in their training. It had no alphabet, no written form that could be studied or analyzed. Its syntax operated on principles unlike Indo-European languages. Its tonal qualities created meaning through pitch variations that speakers of tonal Asian languages might recognize but could never interpret without extensive exposure to Navajo specifically. More importantly, Johnston knew that the complexity of Navajo grammar created a natural barrier to adult language learning. Even linguists who dedicated years to studying the language struggled to achieve conversational fluency. The verb system alone, with its intricacies of tense, aspect, and subject-object marking, defeated most attempts at mastery. Japanese intelligence officers, no matter how brilliant, would face an impossible task. They would need to identify the language first. Then they would need to find linguistic reference materials that barely existed. Then they would need to analyze a linguistic structure unlike anything in their experience. And they would need to do all of this while American Marines were using the language not for simple conversation, but as the foundation for a military code that added another layer of encryption on top of an already impenetrable linguistic base. Johnston contacted Major General Clayton B. Vogel, the commanding general of the Amphibious Corps, Pacific Fleet. He proposed using Navajo speakers as combat communicators. Vogel's initial response reflected the skepticism of a career officer being asked to entrust military communications to an untested, unconventional system that defied every principle of signals intelligence. But Vogel agreed to a demonstration. The 4 Navajo men Johnston brought to Camp Elliott on that February morning in 1942 were friends he knew from Los Angeles, where they worked in various civilian occupations while maintaining their connection to the Navajo Nation. They understood English perfectly. They spoke Navajo fluently, and they were about to prove that their bilingual capability could save American lives. Colonel Jones and his staff prepared a test under conditions designed to simulate combat stress. They gave the Navajo speakers a 3-line military message written in English. The message contained typical battlefield information, coordinates, unit designations, tactical instructions. One Navajo speaker received the English message. He translated it into Navajo and transmitted it by radio to another Navajo speaker positioned out of sight. The second speaker received the Navajo transmission, translated it back into English, and wrote down the message. The entire process took 20 seconds. 20 seconds for a 3-line message that Sigaba machines required 30 minutes to encrypt and decrypt, and the Navajo transmission was delivered with perfect accuracy, word for word, exactly as it had been sent. Colonel Jones watched this demonstration with the expression of an officer who had just witnessed something that violated his understanding of how military communications worked. But he understood the implications immediately. If Navajo speakers could maintain this speed and accuracy under actual combat conditions, the Marines would possess a communication system faster than any cipher machine, immune to cryptographic analysis, and impossible for the enemy to counterfeit. General Vogel saw the same potential. On March 6, 1942, he wrote to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, recommending the initial recruitment of 200 Navajo speakers for the Amphibious Corps. His letter detailed the advantages with the precision of an officer who understood he was proposing something unprecedented. The Navajo dialect, Vogel noted, was regarded as completely unintelligible to other tribes. Fewer than 30 Americans who were not Navajo possessed even superficial knowledge of the language. The Germans, who had studied Native American languages before the war in anticipation of another Choctaw-style experiment, had focused their anthropological research on other tribes. The Navajo Nation's isolation and the language's complexity had kept it beyond their reach. Vogel emphasized one point with particular force. The Navajo code talkers would not simply speak their native language over the radio. That would be vulnerable to anyone who learned Navajo, however unlikely that possibility might be. Instead, they would develop a formal code that used Navajo as its foundation but added military terms that didn't exist in the traditional vocabulary. The commandant approved the program with one modification. Instead of 200 recruits, the initial authorization covered only 30. This would be a pilot program, proof of concept, a test to determine whether Johnston's idea could actually work in combat. On May 4, 1942, 29 young Navajo men boarded a bus at Fort Defiance, Arizona. One recruit failed to appear. The remaining 29 traveled to the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego to begin the same 7-week basic training that every Marine recruit endured. These young men came from the most remote corners of the Navajo Nation, from families that still lived in traditional hogans, from communities where Navajo remained the primary language of daily life. Most were teenagers. Some had grown up speaking only Navajo until they were sent to government boarding schools where they first encountered English. The irony of their situation was not lost on them. Many of these recruits had attended schools where speaking Navajo was forbidden, where teachers punished students for using their native language, where the explicit goal of education was to erase indigenous identity and replace it with assimilated American culture. They had been told that their language was worthless, that it had no place in the modern world, that learning English meant abandoning the Navajo way of life. Now the United States Marine Corps was asking them to take that forbidden language and turn it into a weapon of war. After completing basic training on June 27, 1942, the 29 recruits transferred to Camp Elliott for 8 weeks of communications training. They learned radio, operation, message protocols, field maintenance of equipment. They learned to send and receive messages under simulated combat conditions. They learned the principles of military communication that would govern their work in the field, and they developed the code. A Marine cryptographic officer guided them through the principles of letter substitution and word encoding, but the actual creation of the code came from the Navajo recruits themselves. They faced a challenge that required both linguistic sophistication and tactical understanding. They needed to create Navajo terms for military equipment and concepts that had never existed in traditional Navajo life. The solution they developed demonstrated remarkable creativity. For military equipment, they used Navajo words that described the function or appearance of the devices. A submarine became Beshlo, ironfish. A fighter plane became Dahiti High, hummingbird. A dive bomber became Genie, chicken hawk. A battleship became Lotso, whale. For the English alphabet, they created a system where each letter was represented by a Navajo word whose English translation began with that letter. The letter A could be represented by Wullachi Ant, Bilasana Apal, or Tsenil, axe. The letter B could be Shush, bear, Toishje, barrel, or Nahash Chid, badger. This multiple word system for common letters added another layer of security. If Japanese cryptographers somehow identified the language and obtained basic vocabulary, they still couldn't use frequency analysis to crack the code. The letter E, the most common letter in English, had 8 different Navajo representations. Any attempt at statistical analysis would fail because the same letter appeared as different words throughout the message. Words that had direct Navajo equivalents could be transmitted using the standard vocabulary. Words without Navajo equivalents would be spelled out letter by letter using the alphabet system. The code, talkers memorized 211 military terms during this initial training. The vocabulary would eventually expand to more than 400 terms, as the program grew and combat experience revealed additional needs. In late August 1942, the first 29 code talkers completed their training. They had created a code that existed nowhere on paper, that required years of childhood exposure to master, that combined an obscure language with military encryption in ways that made traditional code-breaking approaches completely useless. Now, they needed to prove it would work in combat. Guadalcanal, First Blood. August 7th, 1942. The same day, Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in the first major American offensive against Japan. 2 Navajo code talkers went with them. The campaign for Guadalcanal would last 6 months. It would become one of the most brutal battles in the Pacific War, and it would provide the first operational test of whether the Navajo code could function under the chaos of actual combat. The code talkers faced immediate skepticism from the officers they were assigned to support. Lieutenant Sanford B. Hunt, the signal officer for the 1st Marine Division, had never worked with Navajo Marines. He had faith in the existing codes and procedures. When the code talkers arrived, he decided to test them immediately. On their first night on Guadalcanal, Hunt gave them a message to transmit. The code talkers began sending in Navajo. Within seconds, panicked calls came from other Marine radio operators who thought Japanese infiltrators had broken into their frequency. The transmission was jammed. The test was postponed until morning. The next day, Hunt ordered his radioman not to interfere with the transmission. He gave the code talkers a message to send and started his stopwatch. One code talker translated the English message into Navajo code and transmitted it. Another code talker received the transmission and translated it back into English. 2.5 minutes for a complete message cycle. Perfect accuracy. Hunt was impressed, but the real test would come when artillery coordinates needed to be transmitted while under fire, when tactical situations changed by the second, when seconds of delay could cost lives. That test came quickly. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal included artillery positions with 80mm machine guns that were wreaking havoc on Marine positions. A runner arrived with coordinates for counter-battery fire. The code talker translated the information into Navajo code and spoke into the radio. The message went out in seconds. Artillery began targeting the Japanese positions with accuracy that wouldn't have been possible if they'd had to wait for mechanical encryption. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, the code talkers transmitted tactical communications faster than any previous system allowed. They called in artillery strikes, coordinated infantry movements, relayed supply requests, transmitted intelligence reports. They worked under fire, without pause, maintaining the speed that kept Marines ahead of Japanese responses. And the Japanese, listening to every transmission, had no idea what they were hearing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Army Intelligence Headquarters, September 1942. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, Chief of Intelligence for the Imperial Japanese Army, reviewed the latest intercept reports from the Pacific with mounting frustration. His cryptographers had broken American Army codes. They had deciphered Army Air Corps transmissions. They had cracked nearly every cipher the Americans deployed across multiple theaters of war. But one set of transmissions remained completely impenetrable. The intercepts from Marine Corps units contained sounds unlike anything in Japanese intelligence files. They didn't match English phonetic patterns. They didn't resemble any European language the cryptographers had studied. The tonal qualities suggested possible similarities to certain Asian languages, but the vocabulary bore no relationship to Chinese, Korean, or any dialect Japanese linguists recognized. Arisu's analysts applied every technique in their considerable arsenal. They recorded transmissions and analyzed frequency patterns. They searched for repetitions that might indicate common military terms. They attempted statistical analysis to identify probable word boundaries. Nothing worked. The transmissions remained as incomprehensible on the 100th listening as they had been on the first. The strategic implications were devastating. American Marines coordinated operations in real time, using these mysterious transmissions. Artillery strikes happened with precision that suggested perfect communication between forward observers and fire direction centers. Infantry units maneuvered with coordination that required constant tactical updates. Air support arrived exactly when and where Marines needed it, and Japanese intelligence, despite intercepting every word, could provide commanders with no warning, no intelligence, no advantage. By early 1943, Japanese intelligence officers had intercepted tens of thousands of these mysterious transmissions. The volume of intercepts created its own problem. If the Americans were using these strange communications for everything from tactical coordination to strategic planning, breaking the code became even more critical. But the more transmissions Japanese cryptographers analyzed, the more hopeless the task appeared. The breakthrough Japanese intelligence desperately needed seemed to arrive in the most unexpected way. Among the prisoners captured after the fall of Bataan in April 1942 was a soldier from New Mexico's 200th Coast Artillery. His name was Joe Kiyomiya. He was Navajo. When Japanese interrogators discovered they had a Navajo prisoner, they believed they had found the key to breaking the mysterious Marine transmissions. They brought Kiyomiya recordings of code talker communications and ordered him to translate them. Kiyomiya listened to the transmissions with growing confusion. He heard Navajo words. He recognized the language, but the messages made no sense. He heard words like Daiba, sheep, Bai so di, pig, Moasi, cat, strung together in sequences that conveyed no meaning in ordinary Navajo conversation. He heard animal names, plant names, natural phenomena referenced in contexts that seemed completely random. He told his interrogators the truth. The transmissions sounded like gibberish to him. The Japanese didn't believe him. They assumed he was lying to protect American military secrets. The torture began. Kiyomiya endured months of systematic brutality. His captors beat him daily, demanding he reveal the meaning of the Navajo transmissions. They stripped him naked and forced him to stand for hours in deep snow, telling him he couldn't come inside until he translated the code. When they finally let him return to his cell, a guard shoved him and the skin tore from the soles of his feet where they had frozen to the ground. The beatings continued. At one point, Kiyomiya could no longer use his right leg. He attempted a hunger strike, hoping to end his suffering through starvation. The guards beat him until he ate. What Kiyomiya's torturers couldn't understand was that he was telling them the truth. He wasn't a code talker. He had never been trained in the Marine Corps communication system. He knew nothing about how the code worked. Even if he had wanted to help the Japanese, he couldn't. The code talkers had created something that even native Navajo speakers couldn't decipher without specific training. The irony was profound. The Japanese had captured one of the perhaps 30,000 people on Earth who spoke Navajo fluently. They had direct access to someone who understood the linguistic foundation of the code, and it meant absolutely nothing. The additional layer of encryption the code talkers had built on top of the Navajo language made the entire system immune to linguistic analysis, even by native speakers. By late 1942, the success of the code talkers at Guadalcanal had eliminated any doubt about the program's value. The Marine Corps expanded recruitment. The initial group of 29 grew to 200, then 400. By the end of the war, approximately 420 Navajo Marines would serve as trained code talkers, with another 120 Navajo Marines serving in other capacities. Philip Johnston, now Staff Sergeant Johnston, supervised the training program at Camp Pendleton. Each new class of recruits underwent the same rigorous process. They completed standard Marine Corps basic training first, proving themselves as Marines before becoming code talkers. Then they transferred to the communications school for 8 weeks of intensive training in a program that was classified at the highest levels of military secrecy. The training compound operated under guard around the clock. Recruits couldn't take notes outside the classroom. They memorized the entire code dictionary, which had grown from the original 211 terms to more than 400 terms by 1943. They learned to encode messages at speed, working through combat scenarios where seconds of delay could mean the difference between life and death. The vocabulary continued to evolve based on combat experience. When new weapons or tactics appeared, the code talkers developed new terms. A destroyer became kalo, shark. A bomber became jaysho, buzzard. A reconnaissance plane became ne as jar, owl. Each term reflected careful thought about the characteristics of the military equipment being encoded. The alphabet system also expanded. The most frequently used letters in English E, T, A, O, I, N, S, H, R, D, L, and U received multiple Navajo word equivalents to prevent frequency analysis from revealing patterns. The letter E, for example, could be represented by aja, ear, j, elk, or ana, eye. Any attempt to analyze letter frequency would fail because the same letter appeared as different words throughout each message. As the program grew, code talkers were distributed across all 6 Marine divisions, Marine Raider battalions, and Marine parachute units. They typically worked in pairs. One operated the radio equipment while the other encoded or decoded messages. This redundancy ensured that if one code talker was killed or wounded, the other could continue operating. November 20th, 1943, Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The assault on Betio Island would become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history relative to the number of troops involved. Over 76 hours of combat, more than 1,000 Marines would die, and 2,000 more would be wounded, taking a piece of coral barely 3 miles long. Code talkers landed with the assault waves. They came ashore carrying radio equipment that weighed 30 pounds, moving through water chest deep while Japanese machine guns and artillery turned the lagoon red. They reached the beach and established communication posts in shell craters and behind wrecked amphibious tractors. The battle demonstrated why the code was so essential. Japanese forces had fortified Betio with concrete bunkers and interlocking fields of fire that made traditional assault tactics suicidal. Marines needed to coordinate naval gunfire, airstrikes, and infantry movements with perfect precision. Any miscommunication could result in friendly fire. Any delay in calling for support could allow Japanese defenders to mass forces at breakthrough points. The code talkers transmitted coordinates for naval bombardment while under direct fire. They called in airstrikes with accuracy that placed bombs within yards of Marine positions. They relayed casualty reports, ammunition requests, tactical updates, all in real time using a communication system. Japanese couldn't decipher despite intercepting every transmission. At one point during the battle, a code talker transmitted coordinates for a naval bombardment while a Japanese machine gun position was targeting his location. He completed the transmission, received confirmation from the offshore ship, and then moved to a new position seconds before Japanese fire destroyed his radio equipment. The naval bombardment arrived exactly where it was needed, suppressing the Japanese position long enough for Marines to advance. This pattern repeated across the Pacific as the island-hopping campaign continued. At Saipan in June 1944, code talkers coordinated the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War up to that point. At Guam in July 1944, they transmitted messages that coordinated operations across the entire island. At Peleliu in September 1944, they operated in some of the most brutal terrain the Marines encountered, coral ridges and caves that made communication difficult even under ideal conditions. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima. Thomas Begay stepped off the landing craft into volcanic black sand while Japanese artillery rounds created geysers of sand and shrapnel around him. He was 17 years old. He carried a radio that was his responsibility to protect and operate no matter what happened around him. 6 Navajo code talkers landed at Iwo Jima with the 5th Marine Division. Their mission was straightforward in concept and nearly impossible in execution. They needed to transmit battlefield communications continuously, while Japanese forces subjected them to the most concentrated defensive fire American forces had yet encountered in the Pacific. The Japanese had fortified Iwo Jima with 11,000 underground positions connected by 16 miles of tunnels. They had artillery registered on every yard of the beaches. They had fields of fire planned to create killing zones, where American forces couldn't avoid taking casualties. The battle would last 36 days and kill nearly 7,000 Marines while wounding another 20,000. In the first 48 hours of the battle, the 6 code talkers transmitted more than 800 messages. They called in naval gunfire that suppressed Japanese artillery positions. They coordinated airstrikes that targeted bunkers and cave systems. They relayed intelligence about enemy troop movements observed by forward units. They transmitted casualty reports that brought medical evacuation teams to the right locations. They coordinated the movement of reserve units to reinforce breakthrough points. Every message was transmitted without error. Not one mistake in over 800 critical communications sent under the most intense combat conditions imaginable. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, watched the code talkers work throughout the battle. Years later, he would make a statement that perfectly captured their contribution. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The code talkers worked in shifts around the clock. When one pair needed rest, another pair took over. The radio never stopped. Messages flowed continuously as the battle evolved minute by minute across an island only 8 square miles in area. Japanese forces intercepted every transmission. They recorded them, they analyzed them. They gained nothing. Thomas Begay, crouching in his position on the black sand beach with incoming artillery making the ground shake, translated messages from English into Navajo code and transmitted them in seconds. On the receiving end, another code talker heard the Navajo words, decoded them mentally, and wrote down the English message with perfect accuracy. The entire cycle happened faster than any mechanical encryption system could operate. The psychological pressure on the code talkers went beyond the physical danger. They knew that one mistake, one mispronounced word, one confused translation could send artillery fire onto American positions or misdirect an air strike or create confusion that would cost Marine lives. The burden of that responsibility was immense. They carried it every second of their service. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War involved 180,000 American troops landing on an island defended by 77,000 Japanese soldiers. The battle would last 82 days and become the deadliest single action of the Pacific Campaign. Peter MacDonald, another young Navajo code talker, served aboard command ships during the Okinawa operation. While other code talkers worked on the beaches and at forward positions, MacDonald operated in the Communications Nerve Center, where admirals and generals directed the entire campaign. His role involved constant translation. Messages came in from field units in Navajo code. MacDonald translated them into English and wrote them down. Navy runners took the messages directly to the admiral or senior commanders. When orders came back, stamped secret or confidential, MacDonald translated them into Navajo code and transmitted them to units across the island. The communication networks operated 24 hours a day. A sailor stood behind MacDonald at all times, ready to deliver or receive top-secret messages. The pace never slowed. Orders, intelligence reports, situation updates, casualty notifications, supply requests all flowing through the code talker system in both directions continuously throughout the entire 82 days of the campaign. Japanese intelligence intercepted every transmission. By this point in the war, they had recorded tens of thousands of Marine communications. They had analyzed patterns. They had applied every cryptographic technique in their arsenal. They had tortured Navajo prisoners. They had attempted to find linguistic reference materials. Nothing had worked. The code remained completely unbreakable. After Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, American intelligence officers interviewed senior Japanese military officials. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, when asked about code-breaking successes during the war, made a remarkable admission. Japanese intelligence had successfully broken codes used by the United States Army. They had deciphered Army Air Corps communications. They had penetrated multiple American cipher systems across different branches of service. But there was one code they never broke: the code used by the United States Marine Corps. Arizu didn't know that the code was actually a combination of an obscure language and a sophisticated encryption system layered on top of that language. He didn't know about the Navajo code talkers or how the system worked. He only knew that despite years of effort and hundreds of thousands of intercepted transmissions, his cryptographers had failed completely. The number of intercepted transmissions was staggering. Estimates suggested that Japanese intelligence recorded and attempted to analyze more than 300,000 Marine Corps radio communications during the war. Every single one remained undeciphered. The statistical probability of such complete failure under normal cryptographic conditions would be effectively zero. Traditional codes, no matter how sophisticated, eventually revealed patterns that skilled analysts could exploit. The Navajo code never did. The reason was simple in retrospect, but revolutionary in application. The code combined linguistic obscurity with cryptographic sophistication in a way that defeated every conventional approach to code breaking. Japanese analysts would have needed first to identify the base language, already nearly impossible given how few people had ever studied Navajo. Then they would have needed to obtain reference materials that barely existed. Then they would have needed to recognize that they weren't hearing pure Navajo, but rather an encoded version where words represented other concepts entirely. Then they would have needed to crack the actual cipher system built on top of the language. Each layer alone would have been difficult. Combined, they created a system that was, for all practical military purposes, unbreakable. When the code talkers returned home after the war, they came back to a nation that didn't know what they had done. The program remained classified. The men who had transmitted messages that helped win the Pacific War were forbidden from discussing their service with anyone, including their own families. They returned to the Navajo Nation, where many still faced discrimination, where economic opportunities remained limited, where their service went unrecognized. Some struggled to readjust to civilian life after the trauma of combat. Others faced health problems from their wartime experiences. None could talk about the unique contribution they had made to American victory. The irony was profound and painful. They had used a language that American schools had tried to eliminate, a language they had been punished for speaking as children to protect American lives and help win an American war. And now they had to remain silent about it. The code itself remained classified because military planners believed it might be valuable in future conflicts. The Korean War began in 1950, and the possibility existed that the Navajo code could be reactivated if needed. So, the silence continued. The code talkers kept their secret for more than 2 decades after the war ended. In 1968, the program was finally declassified. The Navajo code talkers could finally speak about their service, but recognition came slowly. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan proclaimed August 14th as National Code Talkers Day. In 2001, the original 29 code talkers who had developed the code received the Congressional Gold Medal. Subsequent code talkers received the Congressional Silver Medal. By then, many of the original code talkers had died without receiving the recognition they deserved. But those who remained alive to receive the medals represented something extraordinary. A group of men who had turned a forbidden language into a weapon that helped win history's largest war, and who had kept that secret for decades afterward without complaint or public acknowledgement. Today, only 2 of the Navajo code talkers remain alive. Thomas Begay and Peter MacDonald, both over 95 years old, carry the memory of what they and their fellow code talkers accomplished. They remember the weight of the radios, the sound of the transmissions, the pressure of knowing that lives depended on their accuracy. They remember friends who didn't come home. They remember the strange experience of using their native language as a military asset after a lifetime of being told that language had no value. The code they used represents a unique moment in military history. It was the only code in modern warfare that was never broken despite hundreds of thousands of interception attempts. It combined ancient linguistic tradition with modern cryptographic innovation. It proved that sometimes the most sophisticated solution comes from the most unexpected source. The story of the Navajo code talkers reveals a historical irony deeper than simple military innovation. Young Navajo men who had been sent to boarding schools, where speaking their language was forbidden, used that forbidden language to protect American forces. A linguistic tradition that colonization had tried to eliminate became essential to American military success. The language that schools had called worthless proved more valuable than the most sophisticated machines the 20th century could produce. And perhaps most remarkably, these men carried two burdens simultaneously, the burden of combat and the burden of silence. They fought in the deadliest battles of the Pacific War, while carrying radios and transmitting messages that marked them as high-value targets. They experienced the same terror, witnessed the same carnage, faced the same dangers as every other Marine, but they also carried the additional weight of knowing that they were the only ones who could perform their specific mission, that the code existed nowhere on paper, that if they were killed or captured, that knowledge would die with them. When the war ended, they returned home and kept silent for 23 years. They lived with the memories of what they had done and what they had seen, unable to share those memories with anyone. The men who had transmitted the messages that helped win the Pacific War remained unknown even to their own families. The Navajo code talkers demonstrated something essential about courage, that it comes in many forms. It takes courage to storm a beach under fire. It also takes courage to keep a secret for decades, while the contribution you made goes unrecognized. It takes courage to serve a country that had not always served you well. It takes courage to use a language you were punished for speaking to protect the lives of those who had punished you. Their story endures not just as military history, but as human history. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest innovations come from unexpected places, that languages and cultures we might dismiss as irrelevant can prove essential when circumstances change, that young men can bear tremendous responsibilities with grace and skill, that silence can be as difficult as combat, that recognition, even when delayed by decades, still matters. The Navajo code remains unbroken to this day. Not because no one has tried to break it, the Japanese tried with everything they had, but because some combinations of language, culture, and innovation create something genuinely unbreakable. 300,000 intercepted transmissions, decades of analysis, the torture of prisoners who spoke the language, the deployment of the best cryptographic minds the Japanese military possessed. None of it mattered. The code held. And in that achievement lies a truth worth remembering, that human language, especially languages maintained by small communities against enormous pressure to abandon them, contains within it forms of knowledge and complexity that no amount of technological sophistication can replace. The Navajo code talkers proved that in the most dramatic way possible under fire, in combat, when lives hung in the balance, they transmitted their messages in a language that had survived centuries of cultural pressure. They encoded those messages with a system that even native speakers couldn't decipher without training, and they did it all while young men far from home, fighting a war that demanded everything they had. The code was never broken. The language survived. And the men who used that language to change history deserve to be remembered not just as code talkers, but as Marines, as warriors, as keepers of knowledge that proved essential when their country needed it most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.